In the next couple of classes, we're going to be transitioning towards the Civil War, and the Civil War is how we're going to end the semester, right? American history this semester, and we're also going to see as we get towards it how the political system that we laid out in the last class is going to set the train of events in motion that's going to get to the Civil War. That is, you're going to have an underlying cause for the Civil War, slavery, but the failures of the political system to get rid of slavery, to figure out a way to deal with the underlying emotions of slavery, is something that is going to be a key cause in meaning that slavery dispute is going to lead to violence. And one of the ways it's going to do that is through this essay topic. This essay topic is going to be the expansion of the United States, an issue called Manifest Destiny. And what I want to see is that in the generation between about 1830 and 1860 or so, you're going to see a United States that is going to have a relentless demand to expand, that is going to want to take over new territories. This is something that's going to be widely popular in the United States. You could even say there was a consensus behind it. So the political system that was always looking to avoid divisive issues is going to hop all over it. However, in practice, once you expand the country, you're going to wind up bringing to the surface the divisive issue of slavery. Right? So the expansion of the country, Manifest Destiny, is something that is really going to wind up, rather than unifying the country, as the politicians hoped when they expanded the country, is going to wind up dividing it. And it's going to set in motion the chain of events that's going to lead you to the Civil War. And to start off with going over the whole idea of expanding the country. This picture tells you a lot about how the American of that era, 1820, 30, 40, 50, would have seen the country. The figure here in the center, the woman flying, is Columbia. Columbia at this time in the 19th century was usually used to represent America. And if any of you play video games, there is a video game series called Bioshock. The last of the Bioshock games was set in a flying city, a city in the clouds. The city's name was Columbia. And actually, what they were trying to do in the game, the writers of the game, was they were trying to reflect back on the whole ideas of American expansion. That is, what would an American have been thinking in the 19th century that was leading them to go forward? Okay, to go out into new areas and bring them into the United States. And here you can see kind of the mentality. That is, if you look at the picture, you go from right to left. On a map, that would be from east to west. Okay? East being where the United States was, west being where the United States is going. And if you look at the difference between east and west, right and left, you see the sun over here, the light. Here you see darkness. So as America is going forward, America is bringing the light with it. So they're seeing expansion as a good thing, that the United States going into these areas is good, right? Not just good for America, it is morally good, right? And when America is going west, what is it bringing with it? You leave here the train, right? You see agriculture, you see settlers, right? That is, America as it is going west to an American is bringing progress. They are bringing the blessings of American civilization, right? Especially if you look in her hands. Columbia is holding here a length of wire that is being strung along. What that is a telegraph wire. And the telegraph was the symbol of technology at that time, it and the railroad. It was the sign of everything that was possible. Right? So America going west was a good thing. It was bringing in with it the light. It was bringing in with it progress, technology. And when America went in, what came out? Well, here you see the Indians departing the scene. Here you see nature represented by the buffalo. Right? So, to an American, this is replacing inferior with superior, right? Bad with good. Right? And overwhelmingly, you would have seen Americans looking at the world this way. That is, all over America, north, south, city, country, you were seeing patriotic Americans saying that America should take over more land. The limits on America were actually very vague at that time. You had people saying that America should expand from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic to Pacific, from pole to pole, the North Pole to the South Pole. That is, the entire Western Hemisphere should be America. Right? So you have an overwhelming consensus behind this idea. It was popular everywhere. So politicians hopped on the bandwagon. Politicians wanted to spread America out. And this, by the way, was an idea called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is saying that the expansion of America was ordained by God. It was manifest. That term was laid out in a article by a man named John Sullivan in 1945, but really it lays out the mentality of this entire period. So you see an America that is starting in 1820 that is looking here and looking for expansion. Right? You have a consensus saying this is a good thing. Politicians want it. Okay? The public wants it. The problems happen when America winds up getting that land. Right? That is, there's an old joke that about dogs chasing cars. What are they going to do when they catch it? Same principle. What's turns going to turn out is that every time new land comes into America, it's going to restart the arguments over slavery. And so expansion, although on the surface it seems uniting, is really going to be divisive for the country. Right? And let's start by looking at this at the 1820s. In the 1820s, settlers from the United States started to look at this part of Mexico. It is called Texas. Perhaps you've heard of it. Right? In the 1820s, the Mexican government was putting incentives on settlers from the United States to cross the border and settle in Texas. That is, they were offering American settlers grants of land in return for settling and holding that territory for Mexico. And they were doing this because they were afraid the Americans would invade Texas and take it. And also, they were afraid of the Indians up here. These were especially the Comanches who regularly raided Mexico. If you have settlers over here, you could stop them. And they were hoping that giving American landowners legal title to land under Mexican rule would make those landowners loyal to Mexico. It didn't work out that way. That is, you see American settlers coming into into Texas in the 1820s. By the time you get to about 1830 or so, you had about as many American settlers over here, Anglo settlers, as you had Hispanic settlers down here. And by the time you get to about 1835 or so, these American settlers want out. The reason they wanted out was primarily because of slavery. And that is, the Americans who came into Texas came in from these states over here. These were the slave states. Particularly, these areas over here were states where they grew cotton. Texas had a lot of land that was good to grow cotton. Right? Being Texas, it has a hell of a lot of land that is good to grow cotton. As there's nothing there's more of in Texas than Texas. So a lot of American landowners came into Texas with their slaves to grow cotton. The problem with this plan was the Mexican Constitution said slavery was illegal in Mexico. Right? The Mexican government initially looked the other way on it, but by the 1830s, they're starting to make noises that they're actually going to enforce their constitution. Right? The Texas settlers are trying to get around this by calling their slaves indentured servants. That is saying they're under contracts. Those contracts just go on for 99 years. The Mexican government increasingly isn't buying it. So the slave owners, the American slave owners who came over into Texas, started getting increasingly uncomfortable under Mexican rule. They're starting to say that Mexico won't protect slavery. They had other grievances with Mexico in addition to that. They had grievances over religion. They had grievances over the authority of the government. Mexico had a very centralized government. The United States had the Anglo settlers there wanted a government held at the local level. But the big issue was slavery. And so by the time you get to 1835, violence is breaking out in Texas, where those American settlers are rebelling against the Mexican government. Right? And into that situation, this man stepped into the picture. His name is Sam Houston. So let me give you his story. Sam Houston was from Tennessee, and he came to prominence primarily because of his connection to an important American. That man's name was Andrew Jackson, who was also from Tennessee. As they went way back, when Jackson was fighting the Creek Indians in the Creek War in 1813, we mentioned this a little bit earlier. Houston was one of his officers. Right? Houston was actually wounded in the battle. He took an arrow around the stomach. Okay? He survived. The wound never really healed. We'll get into that, the significance of that in a minute. When, as the years went on, Andrew Jackson became more powerful in politics, and Houston followed him. Houston himself was pretty charismatic. Right? So Andrew Jackson becomes governor of Tennessee. Houston becomes one of his boys. Jackson quits being governor of Tennessee in 1824 to run for president. So Houston runs to replace him. He wins the election, and he is the next governor of Tennessee. And he seems to have a bright future in politics. He is charismatic, he is ambitious, he is a friend with the most popular politician in the country. Right? So his ceiling looks limitless. So in 1824, as he's running for governor, he decided to get married. He was in his 30s when he decided to get married. The new Mrs. Houston was 18. You could do that back in those days. So he wins the election. They go through with the marriage. Right? So Houston brought the new Mrs. Houston up for the wedding night. Apparently, he never told Mrs. Houston about his war wound that he got in the Creek War. He got an arrow into the area around his stomach. The arrow wound never actually closed. He had what is called a fistula. That is, you had an opening in the skin where an arrowhead was in there and it oozed out every now and then blood and pus. Right? So Mrs. Houston came up, okay, for the wedding night. Sam Houston took off his shirt and Mrs. Houston ran out crying. She never came back. In the America of 1824, that was humiliating. It meant that you weren't a real man. It was so humiliating that Sam Houston was forced to resign as governor. He never actually served. Right? And he was ruined. He wound up in humiliation going to live with the Cherokee Indians in Tennessee, where he earned the nickname among the Cherokees, Big Drunk. If you drink enough that the Cherokee Indians notice, you have issues. Meanwhile, his friend Andrew Jackson becomes president. In 1832, Andrew Jackson expelled all the Cherokee Indians from the United States in something called the Trail of Tears. So the Indians that Houston was living with walked from Tennessee to Oklahoma. Houston walked with them. And in 1835, when the violence is breaking out in Texas, Sam Houston is living with the Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. The Cherokees approached him and they said, "Why don't you go to your friend Andrew Jackson and tell him to lighten up on us?" So Houston said, "Okay." Actually, he was probably drunk at the time, so he probably said something more like, "Ah." Anyway, he gets on a train, he goes to Washington, D.C. He goes to the White House and he goes up to Andrew Jackson and says, "Andy, lighten up on the Cherokee Indians. Andrew Jackson said, screw the Cherokee Indians, you're going to Texas. The next thing Sam Houston knows, he is going to Texas. He stops in Tennessee first to pick up some friends. These volunteers follow him along. They then stop at the U.S. Army Arsenal in Shreveport, Louisiana, and help themselves to the guns. They then cross the Sabine River, and they are now the Army of the Republic of Texas. And Texas fought for its independence with muskets with USA for U.S. Army stamped on them. Okay. Meanwhile, Mexico sends an army to try to put down the violence in Texas, to bring Texas back under control. It is personally headed by the president of Mexico, a guy named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna called himself the Napoleon of the West. That is, Napoleon Bonaparte was considered to be the best general in the history of the world in the early 1800s. He led France to a series of military victories in Europe. So, Santa Anna was kind of grandiose. In reality, primarily how he won his battles up to this point was every time some place in Mexico rebelled against him, he took an army up there and massacred them. So he is going to go over and put down the revolt in Texas. So Santa Anna took an army and crossed the Rio Grande River to go towards San Antonio. His army was primarily made up of peasants from the Yucatan. That is, Yerba been to Cozumel, that area is the tropics. He winds up going into Texas in the coldest winter in the entire history of Texas. That is, it was snowing when he crossed the Rio Grande River. So you've got a bunch of barefoot peasants from the Yucatan. They are not going to do well in that kind of weather. So his army starts to lose guys, but he makes it to San Antonio. Meanwhile, Sam Houston took charge of the defense of Texas. He ordered all military units to meet him at a place called Washington on the Brazos, which was the Texas capital. It's near the present site of Navasota. He especially wanted Texas units to evacuate San Antonio because they didn't have many men in San Antonio. He didn't think they could hold it. He would rather bring all of his men together to fight together. The officer in charge of San Antonio, though, a guy named William Travis, said, screw that. I'm going to stay here and fight for San Antonio. He only had 125 guys. Santa Anna was coming with 3,000. So he took his 125 guys and put them all into a building in the center of San Antonio. It was called the Alamo. The Alamo was a mission built in the 1700s, and Travis put his men there in order to create a defensive position until they were relieved. He did this even though he had orders to go toward Washington on the Brazos, and Sam Houston already told him that nobody was coming. So let's take a look at Travis's plan. He's going to take no more than 150 people and put them into this more or less square-shaped perimeter. The wall around the perimeter is only about 3 feet high. If any of you ever been to the Alamo, you can make it over that wall pretty easily. With 150 people, a 400-yard perimeter means that you're going to have large areas where you're not going to have anybody really defending it. That is, you're going to be spread pretty thin. If he puts all his guys here and Santa Anna surrounds him, then he has no avenue of escape. That is, there's no way that he could go to retreat. He also has no way to bring in supplies into his position. Basically, if you have a military background, you recognize that William Travis was an idiot. Right? And by the way, this is how the United States worked at this time. If you are, the United States was a culture that aggressively believed the idea that all men are created equal. So nobody really thought that they could be told what to do. If you were a military officer, this made your life very difficult because nobody in your command actually felt that they had to follow your orders. Basically, getting them to go anywhere was like herding cats. This was even true in the Civil War as well. You don't really see American culture become more regimented until you start seeing factories coming in later on in the century. Right? So Houston's got an officer who isn't listening to him, and that officer does something monumentally stupid. So Santa Anna comes up with 3,000 men and artillery pieces. So if you're Santa Anna, what would you do? Well, one option you got is you could just surround the Alamo, cut it off from supplies, cut it off from reinforcements, wait for the people on the inside to run out of food, and they will give up. Option number two is you could surround the Alamo, and while you're surrounding it, take those cannons you brought with you and blow the crap out of the Alamo. Option number three is since you have 3,000 men and they have less than 200 over a pretty big perimeter, you could launch probing attacks. You could see where their defenders aren't. You could climb over that short wall, okay, take over places within the Alamo. All of those seem like perfectly good plans. So, what did Santa Anna decide to do? He took his men up to the front door and tried to launch a frontal assault. Right? As Napoleon of the West, he left something to be desired. Right? So even though he outnumbered them about 20 to 1, he took heavy casualties. That is, he just kept sending people to try to rush the door, and sharpshooters behind the fence picked them off. Eventually, though, the forces inside the Alamo ran out of ammunition and food, and Santa Anna and his men took the position. They then took the defenders of the Alamo and had them executed. This was something that Santa Anna had done many times in Mexico. That is usually when you had a rebellion against him, he executed the rebels. His goal there was to instill terror in the heart of the other rebels so the rebellion falls apart. And indeed, that is what happened among the Texas Army. As soon as the Anglos of Texas heard what happened to the Alamo, they just ran like hell. A panic broke out. It was called the runaway scrape in Texas history. That is, you saw Anglos leaving their farms and running towards the American border. At the head of the line was Houston's army. They took off from Washington on the Brazos and headed off in this direction. But in doing this, Santa Anna made a critical mistake. And the critical mistake was he did not realize who his actual enemy was. That is, he was thinking in terms of rebels in a province. But remember who the commanding officer of the other side was. The commanding officer of the other side was a personal friend of the President of the United States. He had brought in with him an army primarily of volunteers from the United States. They were armed with American weapons. Most of the Anglo settlers in Texas had only come in within the previous year. So if Santa Anna massacres a bunch of people that were recently in the United States, maybe the United States will get so outraged that they'll cross the border and come in after him. They didn't, primarily because they didn't have to, and I want to get into why that will be in a second. And then we'll come back to this idea because this is central to understand what this is what's all about and why it's going to go bad. Anyway, so Sam, Sam Houston and his army started running in this direction. They go down what is present day Highway 290, and they get towards the present day city of Houston and go east. Houston's plan is to go all the way to Louisiana. Right? because he figures he could cross the border into American territory. Santa Anna can't follow him. There he can regroup. He could get more American volunteers. He could get more assistance from the American government, recross the border, and fight another day. This is a very sensible plan. However, he didn't carry it out. Why he didn't was because after the initial panic wore off, Sam Houston's army wanted to fight. It didn't matter that fighting was probably a stupid idea. They wanted to fight. And they told Sam Houston, if you don't stop the fight, we'll get rid of you and get another officer who will fight. So Sam Houston, as a result, took his army and stopped the fight. He stopped at near where the present day Houston Ship Channel is, near the port, okay, where Buffalo Bayou meets the San Jacinto River, okay, at San Jacinto. Right? Houston's plan was he would just hang out here for a while, let the soldiers get bored, and then take off again towards Louisiana. But he had to stop in order to keep them from bitching. Because remember, commanding his army was like herding cats. In the meantime, Santa Anna had his men march double time through the night to get to San Jacinto to meet up with him. Right? So Houston set up his camp over here in the woods along Buffalo Bayou. Santa Anna set up his camp over here. Right? The next morning, Houston put his guys out on the field. Santa Anna put his guys out on the field. They made a lot of noises, they banged a lot of drums. Neither one of the armies moved. Houston's plan was if Santa Anna started marching towards him, he would haul ass towards Louisiana because he figured he was outnumbered, he didn't want to fight. Santa Anna, on the other hand, just figured he'd wait here and wait for Houston and his guys to come towards him. They didn't move. This went on for the remainder of the day. Finally, when it got to the afternoon, both sides gave up. They went back to their camps. Right? When Santa Anna's army got back to its camp, it was exhausted. It had been marching through the night and had been standing out in the field in the sun the whole day. So most of Santa Anna's men went to bed. They went into their tents, fell asleep. In order to entertain his men while they were asleep, Santa Anna had his brass band started playing. They started playing a popular song of the day, Will You Come Out to the Mower? In the meantime, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Houston's army got back out in the field and started marching forward. This seems like a pretty dumb thing to do because they didn't have night vision goggles. They only had about a couple of hours worth of sunlight, at which time they can't fight anymore. So why launch an attack at 4:30 in the afternoon? Well, basically, Houston's men went up to him and said, "If we don't fight, we're getting another officer who will let us fight." Right? So Houston, against his better judgment, started marching. But as he marched forward, Santa Anna, his opponent, didn't bother to put any sentries over here. That is, the terrain of this land was you have over here a slope that goes up until you get to a ridge. At the top of the ridge is where the present monument is, if you've ever been here. Then the ridge goes back down and it slopes downward till you get towards where Santa Anna's camp is. Santa Anna never bothered to put a lookout on the top of the ridge. So his army never saw Houston's forces go forward. Since his men were asleep and he had a brass band playing, Santa Anna's forces couldn't hear Houston's men coming either. So they don't know they're under attack until the Texas army gets all the way up right over here. And where Santa Anna set up his camp, if you can see here from the picture, he did not give his men any room to maneuver. Behind them was a lake, beside them was a river. And he has a lot of men condensed into a very small area. So when Houston's men start running down the ridge towards them, he has no time to organize a defense, and his men have nowhere to retreat to or run. The battle that followed was a total massacre. That is, Santa Anna's men were disorganized, and Houston's people just basically blew the crap out of them. Right? They were yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," which was another time where the Mexican army uh, killed all the prisoners of a Texas force. Right? At the end of the day, most of Santa Anna's army is gone, and Santa Anna tried to escape. He put on a private's uniform and tried to walk away from the scene. He might have made it, except for two of his privates came up to him and saluted him, said, "Viva el Presidente." Many people in the future would look at this and interpret it racially. Okay? That is, as some kind of an insult towards Mexicans. But put yourself in the position of one of those privates. You were led by an idiot who marched you straight into a massacre. Are you going to let him walk away? But anyway, Santa Anna gets caught. Right? When Houston caught him, they cut a deal. Santa Anna said, "I will take my army out of Texas if you let me go." They let him go. The Mexican army went away. So in the summer of 1936, the Mexican army is gone. So what happens to Texas then? Texas asked the United States to annex them. Why would they do that? Well, that was the point in the first place. That is, what you're seeing here is, right, what you would call, let me see, what's the word that they use for this today? It's I guess, a state-sponsored militia. Right? That is, although technically the Texas forces say they're fighting for Texas, remember, the entire army came from the United States. Most of them had come from the United States within the previous 12 months. Actually, the majority came in with Sam Houston only as the war was starting. They were bringing in American weapons provided to them by the American Army. Their leader was a personal friend of the American president. Right? So what you were seeing here was an informal way for the United States to take over Texas. This is manifest destiny at work. The Anglos within Texas wanted to be a part of the United States. The United States wanted them. So this went to Congress, and they figured it would be a technicality. Congress would annex Texas, it would become a state, the end. But that's where it gets complicated. How it got complicated was, remember, there were a lot of people in the northern states who wanted slavery to go away. This is what led to the whole crisis in Missouri. And what had they seen in the previous 10 years? They had seen another slave state, Missouri, come into the country. Right? They had seen slavery seem to be becoming more and more entrenched. So the last thing they wanted was more territory for slavery. So anti-slavery congressmen tried to block the annexation of Texas. And within Congress, this became a very divisive issue. It was so divisive that Andrew Jackson decided to pull the annexation of Texas from Congress. So he wrote a letter to Sam Houston saying, "It's just too controversial to bring you into the country now. Stay outside for a while and we'll try again later." So what Texas wound up becoming was an independent nation. For the next 9 years, Texas is going to be an independent republic. Right? This was never the plan. It just kind of worked out that way. It worked out that way because although the expansion of the United States was popular among a broad section of the country, every time you expand the country, you've got to decide whether or not to allow slaves in the new territory. And once slaves were going to be in Texas, anti-slavery people didn't want Texas. Right? So this is what I meant when I said how the expansion of the United States is going to wind up, although it is popular, becoming divisive because every time you expand, you bring in that argument over slavery. So Texas, for 9 years, winds up being independent. This has generated a lot of nostalgia within the state of Texas. It shouldn't, because in its 9 years of independence, Texas was a failed state. Right? It was always tottering on the edge of bankruptcy. Right? Uh, One of the reason why was right after Texas became independent, you had the Panic of 1837, a huge worldwide depression. The entire Texas economy was based off of selling cotton. When the price of cotton crashed, Texas crashed with it. But also, Texas found that it was unstable. Right? It was unstable for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons it was unstable was because of slavery. That is, in order to really take advantage of the cotton economy, they had to bring in slaves. And slave owners were afraid to do it because Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas. What happens if they come back in and take over again? You lose your slaves. The Texas government was always very unstable. Right? So, what happens if there's a military coup? If law and order falls apart, you lose your slaves. Right? And by the time you get in 1845, the future of slavery in Texas is actually not really secure. That is, Texas had so many economic problems that the government of Texas was going towards the governments of England and France to try to get assistance. England and France wanted to help Texas because English foreign policy was based off of three words: divide and conquer. They wanted every nation other than England to have an enemy. They figured if nations are fighting against each other, they won't gang up on England. The United States had no enemy. So the UK wanted to provide them one. That is, if Texas succeeded, it could be a counterweight to the United States. It could be a nation that would, okay, be a thorn in America's side, force America to send troops out to watch it, so on and so forth. However, within England, the public wouldn't allow a lot of support for Texas because Texas was a slave nation. Slavery was very unpopular in the UK. So England and France approached Texas with a deal. The deal was, if you outlaw slavery, right, we will recognize your independence and we will provide you economic assistance. We will also provide you security guarantees. We'll send troops, we'll send the Navy over there to make sure that nobody else comes in. Right? The situation in Texas by 1844 was desperate enough that it was conceivable that a Texas government could take them up on their offer. So slave owners in Texas wanted in the United States pretty badly because America was the greatest slave owning nation in the history of the world. Texas, the United States was the place where the Constitution protected slavery, where you have an entire army that will be there to put down a slave revolt. So by 1844, Texas slave owners are pushing the United States for annexation again. And in 1844, you have an election in the United States. Right? One candidate in this election was a guy named Henry Clay. Henry Clay ran for president a lot. The other candidate would come from the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party went through a number of rounds, but they could never come up with a candidate. Finally, they settled on the Speaker of the House of Representatives, a guy named James K. Polk from Tennessee. Polk, in order to unite the party behind him and to unite the country behind him, made manifest destiny the central idea of his campaign. He said that if he was elected, he would re-annex Texas, right, and he would reoccupy Oregon. Right? That is, what Oregon was, this area here in the Pacific Northwest. Let me get over here for another map. was an area that the United States had a claim on when Lewis and Clark, the explorers, got here in the early 1800s. The British also had a claim on this area when the explorer James Cook got there about 50 years earlier. So this area over here, between what is today about the center of British Columbia and the California-Oregon border, was jointly administered by the United States and Britain. So Polk ran for president saying he was going to annex Texas and he was going to make sure that all of this area over here became part of the United States. One of his slogans was 5440 or fight. 5440 is this line over here of longitude. He said that all the land south of it in Oregon was going to be the United States. Polk won his election. Right? As soon as he won, the first thing Polk did was he sent ambassadors to Britain to cut a deal over Oregon. What they agreed on was that they were going to cut it in half. That is, all this area north of this line would become Britain, all of this area south of the line would become the United States, with the exception of Vancouver Island that would go to Britain, that would become part of Canada. Once Oregon's out of the way, he concentrates on Texas. One of the things that was an issue at the time was what exactly was Texas? The Mexicans said that the province of Texas's border was the Nueces River, where present-day Corpus Christi is. The Anglo-Texans, though, said that the border of Texas was the Rio Grande River. So what is present-day Santa Fe, New Mexico, was part of Texas, according to them. So you have Texas with a whole lot of area disputed, whether or not it was in Mexico or whether it was in Texas. So as soon as Polk becomes president, he sends an army to Corpus Christi, right, on the Texas side of the border. The Mexicans respond by sending an army to Matamoros. So both sides are keeping their troops out of the disputed territory. Polk then orders the American army to march to Brownsville, which is deep in the disputed area. The Mexicans don't do anything. So Polk then sends new orders to an army. He tells them to cross the Rio Grande River and keep going south until some Mexicans shoot at him. And before they could do that, though, a handful of Mexican sentries fired at a handful of American sentries across the river. Polk then sent word to Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil, that Mexican soldiers attacked American soldiers in Texas and asked for a declaration of war against Texas. Against Mexico. He got it. So American soldiers went in and not only took Texas, they went in and took everything between Texas and the Pacific Ocean. All the areas of what is today the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And they went into northern Mexico as well. What Polk wanted was manifest destiny. That is, he wanted even more territory than Texas, and he was using this war with Mexico as a pretext in order to take it. And it was very unclear over what he saw the limit of the territory he was going to take from Mexico from. The limit of what territory he was going to take from Mexico. As far as I knew, he would take all of what is today northern Mexico away. Right? And so the United States Army, being better organized, better led, better equipped, defeated the Mexican army pretty easily at the end. But this is where it got complicated. And it got complicated for the same reason that the annexation of Texas got complicated in the first place: slavery. And let's go over this. Let's put yourself in the position of somebody who was opposed to slavery. You had been promised a whole bunch of land over here where there could be no slavery. The guy you voted for said he would go to war to make sure that all of this land came in. He didn't give it to you. Instead, he cuts a deal. And then he winds up invading a lot of land which had nothing to do with anything. Right? Land where possibly slavery could go. And then you find out that an entire war with Mexico was started by a statement that wasn't actually true. Right? That is, that it wasn't that Mexicans fired on soldiers in Texas. It was a shot in a disputed area. And for all you knew, that first shot was in land that was undisputably Mexico. Right? So anti slavery people saw this as a betrayal, and a number of them saw it as a conspiracy. Remember, the United States is very vulnerable to conspiracy arguments. Paranoia is something built into American political culture. And by the time you get to the Mexican War, you start to see a conspiracy theory spreading about slavery among anti slavery people. It's called the slave power conspiracy. The slave power conspiracy said that there's a secret group of slave owners who want to spread slavery everywhere and reduce everybody but them to slaves, regardless of their race. These people operate in secret, and they use bribery and corruption to undermine the people's government. They're spreading like a cancer, and if they're not stopped, they will destroy the country. The only way you can stop them is to unite behind a hero who will bring the conspiracy out to the light of day and crush it. Basically, this is the same conspiracy argument you heard over the Masons, the same conspiracy argument you heard over the Democratic Party from the Whigs, the same conspiracy argument, okay, that Andrew Jackson gave about the Bank of the United States. Only now it is being used against a powerful force in the United States, the slave owners, the leaders of one of the divisive issues in the country. And if you're prone to conspiracies, you can see all kinds of things that you could see as proof of this. The whole surrender of Oregon, cutting a deal there. The whole start of the war on kind of false pretenses, on a pack of lies. The whole invasion of whole bunches of areas that could be growing cotton. Right? So the war itself became very divisive. As this war went on for any period of time, it would tear the country apart between people who supported slavery and people who opposed slavery. Right? And the war, in fact, did go on for a while. Because although the Mexican armies collapsed pretty quickly, once American forces got into Mexico, they found that the Mexicans wouldn't stop fighting anyway. Because if you've ever been to northern Mexico over here, this is pretty rugged country. It, that is, you can go in there, you can see canyons, mountains, dead ends. If you don't know that area, you'll never find your way around them. When the Mexican gangster El Chapo escaped from jail, that's where he went. He figured the Mexican police would never find him there. So when the American military forces went into northern Mexico, they found themselves fighting a guerrilla war that wouldn't stop. The Mexican government wouldn't surrender, and those troops just kept on fighting. Right? And this went on month after month after month. They tried to bring the war to a conclusion by sending in another army to Veracruz and marching it to take the Mexican capital, Mexico City. They achieved this in 1847. That didn't end the war either. The war just kept dragging on and on and on and on and on. And as the war dragged on, the political divisions over the war grew more and more intense. By the time you get into 1846, a congressman is putting forward a resolution in Congress demanding that the government say the exact spot where the first shot was fired. Just find out whether it's fired in the United States or Mexico. That obscure congressman's name was Abraham Lincoln. This was the first thing that brought him to national prominence. He got the nickname Spotty Lincoln as a result. And so you have in the United States now a war for expansion now becoming a divisive issue over slavery. One other thing that will show you this is if any of you are familiar with American literature, philosophy, there was a philosopher named Henry David Thoreau. He wrote a book called Walden, right, about living by a pond. Some of you might have read it in high school. But he also wrote an essay on civil disobedience. where he said, "It is the duty of all just men to oppose injustice. If you cooperate with an unjust government, you are cooperating with injustice. So you have to not cooperate with an unjust government." He used that as justification for not paying taxes. That is, he said that the taxes were going to support a evil war in Mexico and to support slavery. Right? So you're seeing that level of division hitting the American culture. That is the expansion, the invasion of Mexico to expand, something that in 1844 looked popular, now is becoming divisive. The invasion of Mexico also brought in another division that we'll get to in your next class, and that has to do with religion. That is, in the 1840s, you started to see a lot of immigration coming into the United States from Europe to fill in the factories. A lot of those immigrants were coming in from Catholic countries like Ireland. The United States had never had a Catholic population before. The United States was overwhelmingly Calvinist. That was actually one of the grievances the American settlers had with the Mexican government. Mexico was a Catholic country. Those American settlers in Mexico were Protestant. Right? So once the American army, a Protestant army, came into Mexico, they started trashing Catholic institutions. Because at that time, an American Protestant was somebody who was highly anti Catholic. They used to refer to the Catholic Church as the Scarlet Whore of Rome in America. So you'd hear stories like the U.S. Army would stable their horses in Mexican cathedrals. Right? They would desecrate churches, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, a group of Irish Catholics formed a brigade in the U.S. Army. They saw the desecration of Catholic facilities in Mexico and were outraged. They were so outraged that they defected as a unit to Mexico. This was the first time, only time in American history that ever happened. The Mexicans started calling them the San Patricio Brigade for St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. Eventually, this brigade would be caught and the entire unit would be hanged for treason. But you're seeing here the division within the country. The Mexican War, the expansion of the country, is dividing the country between opponent of slavery and supporter of slavery. It's dividing it between Protestant and Catholic. And remember, this political system hated divisions. They wanted to paper over all of them. They wanted to avoid all issues. And they find that the way they were trying to do this by expanding the country was just bringing in more divisions. Right? So by 1848, the government is stuck. They have invaded Mexico and they can't find a way out. Okay? The political situation within the United States is getting worse and worse. So President Polk doesn't know what to do. One idea he has is figured he would unilaterally declare a new border for Mexico and unilaterally say the war is over. How would he make sure that the Mexicans stayed on their side of the border that he was going to draw up? He was going to build a wall. However, while he was doing that, an American diplomat started negotiations with the Mexican government. And that diplomat and the Mexican government struck a deal. The deal was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty ended the war between the United States and Mexico. If the Mexican government had held out longer, they might have been able to win the war because the United States had no way to put down the guerrillas. Basically, the Mexican War was a preview of what you'd see in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So why did the Mexican authorities cut the deal? Because by 1848, they were more afraid of their own people than they were afraid of the Americans. That is, a bunch of Mexican peasants had picked up guns and were fighting the Americans. The Mexican landlords were afraid that those peasants, once they were done with the Americans, would turn on the landlords. That is, you had a handful of people who owned all of Mexico and a bunch of peasants who just worked for them for free. So in order to keep the peasants down, they figured the safest thing to do was end the war. So they agreed to draw up a new border between the United States and Mexico. It is more or less the current border that is around today. As part of the treaty, Mexican landowners in the United States were supposed to keep their property. By and large, they didn't. These cases were in court up until the 1970s. But anyway, if you're in the United States, problem solved. You have now gotten a whole bunch of land from Mexico and the war is over. However, if you're Congress, now you have substituted one divisive issue, the war with Mexico, for a second divisive issue. And that is, what do you do with all this land? Do you allow slavery to come into that land, or do you keep slavery out of the land? Remember, slavery is a divisive issue, and the politicians don't want to talk about it. Right? Congress figured that they could avoid this issue just by not doing anything with this land. That is, they wouldn't pass any legislation about it at all. That way, they could put it off in the future and hope the future worked it out on its own. That's a plan that fit the political system that was around at the time, one that was designed not to deal with issues. It's a plan that might have worked under other circumstances, but it didn't here. And it didn't because of this. Right after the United States took over California, American settlers there found the biggest deposit of gold found in the world up until that point. Right? The latest in a long series of bad luck for Mexico. Mexico ruled California for 200 years. All they got out of it was oranges and acorns. The United States had it for 6 months. They were swimming in gold, baby. So as soon as they found gold in California, people from all over the world came to California to get that gold. Right? They came from the United States. They came from Europe. They came from China. They came from Mexico. And the next thing you know, by 1850, California has 50,000 people living in it. 50,000 people is enough to file for statehood. So the state California held a constitutional convention and drew up a proposed state constitution that would bring in California as a free state. So now Congress has to deal with what to do with this land after all. The divisive issue of slavery is something that they can't duck. So Congress dealt with it through something called the Compromise of 1850. And in the Compromise of 1850, Congress decided that they were going to deal with all of the divisive issues of slavery and get rid of them once and for all. Right? This is what they had to deal with. One issue they had to deal with was California. Can California come into the United States as a state that doesn't have slavery? A second issue they have to deal with is Texas. Texas had a great deal of debt that they had gotten as an independent nation. Texas wants to file for bankruptcy to get rid of these debts. Congress doesn't want to let them. Right? So Texas, if they're not going to file for bankruptcy, they need money in order to pay off their debts. So how do you solve that problem? In this part of Texas over here, what is present-day Santa Fe, New Mexico, the local people did not want to live in Texas. So what do you do with them? They also had a dispute over slavery over Washington, D.C. over here. As opponents of slavery wanted to end slavery in Washington, D.C. because Congress has authority over the laws of Washington, D.C. Right? And Southerners were unsatisfied that northern states were returning enslaved slaves to them. So they want that dealt with too. So all that was thrown in together into the Compromise of 1850. And this is what the Compromise of 1850 decided. The first thing it decided was that California would be allowed into the United States with its anti-slavery constitution. Actually, California didn't just ban slavery in California. The Constitution of California black people in general from California. 4 state constitutions in the 1850s actually did that. They said they made it illegal for black people to move into the state. California was designed for whites only. They also had a very generous Indian policy. They said they would give the Indians of California to anyone who would take them. Right? They settled Texas and New Mexico by giving Texas money in order to pay off its debts in return for drawing up the present border, where all this land from the Rio Grande River over here, as this land is shown in over here, would be given to New Mexico instead. I, they settled Washington, D.C. by banning the sale of slaves in Washington, D.C. That is, they didn't say that you couldn't own a slave in Washington, D.C., they just said you couldn't buy or sell one. Up until that time, they used to host slave auctions on the Washington Mall, if you've ever been up to Washington, D.C. That is, they would set up an auction block right in front of the Capitol. You could go up to it and buy a human being. And they created something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which created a system of federal courts where if you were a slave owner and you said an escaped slave made it to a free state, you would go to that federal court to hear your case to get your slave returned, not to a state court. Okay, so that was the compromise. So let's see who got the better end of the deal. Let's start with California. The opponents of slavery wanted California to come in as a free state. The supporters of slavery didn't. Who got what they wanted? It was the opponents of slavery. California came in as a free state. And by California being as a free state, that now means that as of 1850, they were now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 for Rhode Island, 16 for Maine's free states. And they were 1 for Delaware, 2 for Maryland, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 slave states. That is, the admission of California gave the free states a majority in the Senate. So the balance that had been around ever since the Missouri Compromise was now ended. Right? The second part of this compromise took land away from Texas, where slavery would be legal, and gave it to New Mexico, where slavery may or may not be legal. So that part of the compromise favored the opponents of slavery too. The part of the compromise with the District of Columbia, it didn't give the opponents of slavery everything they wanted. They didn't get to outlaw slavery in the DC. But they set up the precedent that Congress could decide what to do about slavery in DC. Although they didn't end it now, they could do it later. And in the meantime, they had ended the sale of slaves in Washington, D.C. Right? So that part of the compromise favored the opponents of slavery too. The only part of the compromise that favored the slave owners was the Fugitive Slave Act. But all the Fugitive Slave Act did was repeat something that was already in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution said that if a slave escapes to a free state, that free state has to send the slave back to his owner. If the free states could ignore the Constitution, they could ignore the Fugitive Slave Act too. So what you got in the Compromise of 1850 was a compromise that favored the opponents of slavery and gave the slave owners symbolic concessions, which is exactly the opposite of what you saw 30 years earlier in the Missouri Compromise and what you saw opposite of 30 years before that in the Constitution. What has changed now? Well, by 1850, the factories of the free states are as important to the economy as the cotton of the slave states. The factories are getting more important by the day. Right? So the slave states are steadily losing their leverage. The free states have more people. The free states are increasingly having more money. The free states have the future. Right? So the Compromise of 1850 was something that really frightened slave owners. That is, that they now saw their position in the United States was now suspect, that they could not be secure about the future of slavery in America anymore. That if they get pushed any further, maybe they would be better off outside of the United States if they want to preserve slavery than within the United States. Particularly, you can see the shift in that thinking in Texas. 1845, Texas slave owners desperately won in the United States in order to protect slavery. By 1860, they're going to be wanting exactly the opposite, right? Because the Compromise of 1850 was really a wake-up call. It showed how the relative balance of power had shifted in America towards the free states. But so what we've gotten so far is we've seen in expansion manifest destiny, an issue that, although on the surface it unites the country, in practice divides it by bringing back to the surface the issue over slavery. A political system that doesn't want to deal with slavery keeps having to deal with slavery every time the country gets bigger. The political system, however, by 1850, they figure is able to finally figure out a way how to shut the country up. And it's through the Compromise of 1850 they figure they have swept slavery under the rug once and for all. That if any politician is ever active about slavery in the future, he could just say he supports the Compromise of 1850 and lets it end there. However, as we shall see in the next class, it didn't work out that way. During the 1850s, the entire political structure of the United States fell apart. One of the two big political parties, the Whig Party, is going to cease to exist. The other big political party, the Democratic Party, is going to be severely weakened. And with those two political parties no longer strong, they cannot silence debate over issues anymore. Slavery is going to come back with a vengeance, and slavery is going to get caught up with the tool the two political parties developed in order to avoid talking about issues. And that is whacked out conspiracy theories. And we will be going over that in your next class, but for now, I will stop here.